The U.S. and China just renewed their science and technology agreement, a move that's raising a lot of eyebrows here in the States. Why was this decision made, and what could it mean for both countries? Hi, everyone. Welcome to China in the News. I'm Christine, and joining me today, as always, is my co host, Professor Doug Guthrie, a leading China scholar. Doug, for those who might not know, can you explain what the U.S. China Science and Technology Agreement is and why it matters?
So thank you, Christine, for the question. I think it's a really important topic, and I'm so happy to be here talking to you as always. Um, so there are many critical issues here, from national security to technology transfer to international collaboration in areas like climate change and public health. And so there's a lot of issues going on. Um, Now, this is an older agreement. It's over 40 years old. It was first signed in 1979, has been periodically renewed ever since. And it's essentially a framework for scientific cooperation between the two countries, enabling collaboration on issues like climate research, disease control, even disaster response. And so historically, it's been a bridge for diplomacy through science, especially during times of political tension. And so right now, we're in one of those times of political tension. And so we can see why this is coming up again.
So it's been around for decades. Why is so contentious now?
Well, the geopolitical landscape has changed dramatically since then. Back in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping came to visit Jimmy Carter and sort of normalized relations between the two states, I mean, the United States was a very, very powerful economy and powerful geopolitical nation in the geopolitical system, and China was not. China was coming out of a disastrous period under Mao Zedong. There were 800 million people living in abject poverty, and so it just wasn't viewed as much of a competitor then. Um, but today, China is a global superpower. It's the second largest economy in the world, and if you believe my team on the OGL research side of things, we believe it's going to be the largest economy in the world probably within the next decade. And so there are concerns about just China's overall power within the geopolitical system, but there are also concerns about intellectual property theft, technology transfer, national security. And so these changes make the agreement much more politically charged than it was 45 years ago.
That makes sense. What's new about this renewal? Has the agreement been significantly altered?
Yes and no. I mean, the agreement was renewed with certain restrictions, and the Biden administration has tried to address security concerns by limiting the scope of collaboration to less sensitive areas. But critics argue that these changes don't go far enough to mitigate the risks. And so some of the key restrictions and changes that we're seeing right now, first of all, there are enhanced security measures. So there's issues of researcher safety and stronger protections for researchers, including safeguards against harassment and intimidation. Data security is a big issue. And so there's stricter regulations on data sharing and protection to prevent sensitive information from falling into the wrong hands. Um, Intellectual property rights and technology transfer, which has increased scrutiny of technology transfer to ensure that U.S. intellectual property is protected. And then there's the issue of fair competition underneath the intellectual property rights agenda. So here there are provisions to promote fair competition and prevent unfair practices. Now, the other restricted research areas include dual use technologies, so limitations on cooperation in areas with potential military applications, sensitive technologies, so restrictions on sharing sensitive technologies that could impact national security. And there's also in the new version, there's an emphasis on increased transparency. So clearer guidelines to make more explicit the scientific collaboration and minimize risks, and regular reviews of the agreement to adapt to evolving security and technological landscapes. And so it's important to note that the specific details of these restrictions may vary and could be subject to further refinement as the agreement is implemented. But this is just a really, really important area of collaboration between the world's two largest economies.
You talked about a lot of restrictions. You also mentioned climate change still on the table. What areas of collaborations are still on the table given all the restrictions?
Yeah. So, I mean, here again, there is this balance. Like we're in tough competition with China, and we have companies like Apple and Tesla that are so deeply embedded in China, and there's a lot of flows of technology and tacit knowledge. And so these are really where the restrictions are coming out. But then, of course, we have to continue to think about collaboration. And so climate change. Both nations will continue to work together on environmental challenges with particular focus on renewable energy and climate research. Global health. So the agreement aims to enhance collaboration on public health issues, including pandemic preparedness and response. Natural disaster monitoring. So ongoing cooperation will support disaster relief efforts such as the earthquake and flooded monitoring systems. And finally, basic scientific research. And, here we just see a shift towards basic research areas, excluding high-tech sectors, to focus on shared interests that do not pose significant national security risks. So there's really a balance between what the restrictions are, but really finding ways for our two nations to continue to collaborate.
That's great. But then let's talk about the objections. Why are some Republicans calling for the agreement to be delayed until the next administration?
Well, the main argument is that renewing the agreement now could strengthen China's technological capabilities at a time when the U.S. is trying to curb China's rise in critical areas like semiconductors and AI. And so critics also argue that this kind of agreement needs a more comprehensive review, which they believe a future administration might be better positioned to undertake. And, it could also be the case that there are cynics in the system that believe that the Biden administration is trying to tie the Trump administration's hands, and that they should just step back and wait for the Trump administration to take the lead on this. But we're definitely seeing a push forward with this right now, and it's going to be, I think, a lasting legacy of the Biden administration.
There has been also talks about national security risk. Could you elaborate?
Sure. So critics worry that scientific collaboration could be a backdoor for espionage or the transfer of sensitive technologies. There's always concern, especially when some of these scientific areas spill over into critical areas like AI and so we see that with ByteDance and TikTok right now. But then there's also sort of the monitoring of issues that occurred when Huawei was building switching systems for the Chinese government. And so even in areas like basic research, there's a concern that discoveries could be applied in ways that enhance China's military uh, strength, its ability to monitor what people are doing around the world, including in the United States, and its economic competitiveness. And so there's always a balance with these types of agreements because again, uh, our two nations, our economies are very, very deeply tied together. But there are people in the U.S. government and in areas of expertise that are really worried about the overflow and the spill of technology through these agreements.
On the flip side, the State Department has defended the agreement. What are its reasons for continuing this agreement?
Well, the State Department argues that science knows no borders, and global challenges like pandemics and climate change require international cooperation. And so there's a sort of general framework that you know eh, China is an important nation. It's the second largest, most populous nation on the planet. It is the second largest economy on the planet. And, our two economies are very deeply intertwined. And so we need to continue to develop in areas that are both about the encouraging risks like pandemics and climate change, but also just develop cooperatively in a way that can collaboratively reduce those risks. And so if you just sort of embrace an unregulated collaborative agreement, which just favors the economy and is focused towards making as much money as possible, um, you're going to create a lot more risks. And so I think the State Department really believes if we do this right and we do it responsibly, then it's going to be okay. But we have to think about doing it right and doing it responsibly.
So ultimately, it's a balancing act between collaboration and caution.
Yeah. Yes. That balance is incredibly difficult to strike in today's geopolitical climate. But we can remember back to the 1990s and China, the engagement policy under President Clinton and China's partnership with the United States was really deepening and becoming more important. And we had a lot of joint ventures there. And we were arguing that there was a lot of influence happening. And eventually China got into the World Trade Organization. But then it just became a much more powerful economy, rivaling our own economy. And so we still believe and know that we need to collaborate, but we also just have to think about doing it in a cautious way. And so again, this is, I think, why it's important that you don't just allow scientists alone or the market to make these decisions. You have to have the State Department and the executive and the judicial, the executive and legislative branches. So it's important.
So let's step back for a moment. So we talked about the Republican objection. We talked about the State Department's reasoning for continuing this. Is this renewal the right move given the current tension between U.S. and China, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, for anyone to answer this question, it depends on their perspective. And from a scientific standpoint, and a collaborative standpoint, there's incredible benefits. But from a strategic standpoint, the risks are significant. Now, as you know, I'm fundamentally an engagement person. I really believe that heading down a road where we were looking at a new Cold War is just a mistake. I think we influence each other by having close economic ties, close diplomatic ties, close scientific ties. And so we always have to think about striking this balance. But in my personal opinion, I think engagement is better on all fronts because the more we know, and again, there can be spillover of technology and certain things end up in hands where you don't want them. But we'll only know if that's going to happen if we're closely engaged.
And do you think these safeguards are sufficient?
Well, that's hard to say without seeing the exact terms. But given the level of scrutiny and the restrictions added, um, and given the sort of tense nature of U.S. China relations right now, I think, the Biden administration and the State Department are trying very hard to thread the needle. And again, I think collaboration is better than delinking. And so I think that, in my view, they are working hard to thread the needle, and I think they're doing it.
Doug, as always, your insights are invaluable. Thank you for breaking this down for us.
Well, Christine, it's my pleasure, and thank you. This is an incredibly important topic, and I'm so glad we could shed some light on it. And let's just keep continuing to explore these important issues.
And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. If you found this episode informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into China in the news. See you next time.